Recently, Marvel's Avengers was added to Game Pass. Seeing the player numbers soaring, at least on Xbox, from the recent depths that they were held hostage to, there's been talk. Can Marvel's Avengers turn around in a similar way to No Man's Sky and countless other games with rough launches that eventually became their own gaming phenomenons? And I'm here to tell you why nothing can save Marvel's Avengers. And to do that, we need to go back to the birth of the modern superhero game, Arkham Asylum. Rocksteady created the first great superhero game at that point, using Batman's abilities and gadgets, using the grapple to traverse areas, detective vision, the cloak to glide, the combat system to brutalize enemies without killing them, all while facing a plethora of Batman villains. The most common praise of that game? It makes you feel like Batman. We move on to Arkham City. This was an expansion on everything Asylum did well, while expanding onto a much more open area, having a whole section of the city walled off, creating its own little villain paradise or hell, depending on who you ask. While I personally think the game lost some of the claustrophobia and level design that made Asylum so memorable, it was still a fantastic game that told an engaging narrative that again is praised because it makes you feel like Batman. Arkham Knight is an odd one. All of the same mechanics that propelled the first two games were just as present. It's brought down by some key design decisions. The promise of exploring all of Gotham was a lie, when really it's just 3 conveniently deserted islands. The Arkham Knight was way too easy to guess for anyone vaguely familiar with the Batman mythos. And lastly, the most common criticism, the Batmobile. It was a huge focus, and rightfully so. It's synonymous with Batman, but having the Batmobile act like a tank was clearly the wrong direction, as it had some of those features, sure, but it had mainly been used in movies and comics as transport, which is where it probably should have just been left at. At the end of it though, most of the game makes you feel like Batman, just a bit less than its predecessors. We move on to Marvel's Spider-Man in 2018. Insomniac created a web-slinging mechanic that was based on momentum and control. Spider-Man had different gadgets, largely based on different ways to use webs. The combat was undeadly and acrobatic. It had a lineup of his most iconic villains, with telling a deeply personal story about Peter Parker. And again, its most common praise? It makes you feel like Spider-Man. The expand-alone Spider-Man Miles Morales continues almost all web-slinging and traversal mechanics. Combat is still acrobatic, but it's also able to shake things up, with Miles' cloaking and electric ability. It also tells a deeply personal story of Miles trying to prove himself as a Spider-Man, involving his family, friends, and community of Harlem. Again, it's praised because it makes you feel like Spider-Man. There's a reason it makes you feel like insert certain superhero here, because ultimately, that's what people want from their superhero video games. We've grown up. Movies, cartoons, TV shows, comics, games, posters, drink bottles, jumpers, hats, t-shirts, with all these superheroes on them. We've seen different iterations of them. We know how these characters should act. And when it's sitting down to play a game as a superhero, to have that character in our control finally, we want to feel like we've always imagined it should. This is Marvel's Avengers' biggest hurdle. I remember vividly when that first teaser trailer came out. I thought Square Enix and Crystal Dynamics were a bit of an odd choice, but hey, I'd really enjoyed their Tomb Raider games. And at least historically, Square hadn't been overly cutthroat about turning franchises into live service games with cheap tactics to encourage spending money on useless microtransactions. So overall, I was very excited for this. I thought it'd be quite challenging, as they had to individually create and master the gameplay aspects for each individual hero, and then marry that together in co-op or group level design that gives each hero a purpose, as well as a compelling narrative that fit for this iconic team, this wider game and universe. I thought they were on their way to doing this. Exciting hires such as the combat designer from God of War, and pulling from that very talented Southern California group of developers, I was confident in how this was going. Avengers premiered its first look at E3 2019, and I immediately saw the first trap it had fallen into. And to explain this, we need to look at 2 different Avengers cartoons, the first being Earth's Mightiest Heroes, and the second being Assemble. The key difference between these shows is that Earth's Mightiest Heroes' primary inspiration is the comics, taking their looks, story, and characters from there and then making it their own, with some light touches of the MCU sprinkled in. In Assemble, the MCU is their primary inspiration to make the show, and to make it feel like it's somewhat related with the intention for it to be an easier transition for casual audiences. The Avengers game copying the assemble tactic instead of EMH, which it should have. A lot of criticism was handled at this premiere for a lot of different reasons. The first being, it looked a bit like a cheap MCU knockoff, where they were trying to catch the eye of someone immediately to look and think of the MCU before looking closer and realizing that it wasn't. A much safer and more interesting position would be to go deep into the comics and pick different versions of these characters from there. Other criticism was the lack of actual gameplay shown, and the over-focus on the cast playing the characters, the lack of certain characters such as Hawkeye, and even before showing the game talking about future content and DLC. There was a behind doors look at the gameplay for people there, and the overwhelming impression is that they weren't impressed. As we move closer to the eventual delays and then release date, it seemed the damage was done to this game. The general consensus moving towards this game was not so much of hype, but of cautious anticipation. Avengers finally released to a very mixed response from fans and critics alike. I overall really disliked the game for a lot of reasons I'll go over, but as for the key reason, and why this game cannot be saved from things like exposure from Game Pass, or even a potential free-to-play version, this game just doesn't make you feel like either the individual hero you're playing as, or as the Avengers. Just a warning, this will have spoilers for the entire game. I think the overall story campaign is serviceable at best. There are true moments in the linear single-player campaign where you can almost tell this is the same team that made those recent great Tomb Raider games. I feel this particularly with Kamala, as the story is centered around her. I think her character arc is actually quite strong, but it's largely let down by her dialogue. But in any case, picking Kamala as the player's way to explore this world was quite smart. She's a character that deserves the attention, and I'm very much looking forward to her MCU Disney Plus show. Where this game truly falters though in a story aspect is over the other Avengers and the villains. The two most adjacent Avengers in this story is Hulk and Iron Man. Bruce has seemed to have given up on the Avengers and heroes as a whole, and it's Kamala's job to make him see why he's wrong, which she quickly does. And then there's Tony, who has pretty much lost everything from the fall of the Avengers and A-Day. Kamala represents the hope that he needs. These two heroes' arcs are fine, but the ball really drops with the other three. Cap has been captured, thought to be dead, and is imprisoned in space, so he just needs to be freed and then help take down AIM. Black Widow is nothing more than a plot device, pushing significant things that needed to happen in the background to push Kamala, the Avengers, and AIM in the right direction just happened to be her. And Thor just kinda shows up. He's literally only playable in 2 sections, and has next to no actual story here. All these 3 heroes lack any actual character arc. Another major issue is the villains. AIM is fine as a group with a bunch of cannon fodder, and I appreciate the fact they tried to make them somewhat more comic accurate than the MCU, but in a story capacity, this leads to a total of 3 somewhat memorable boss fights: Taskmaster, Abomination, and MODOK. And with the whole Marvel universe of villains at your disposal, just having these 3 is pathetic. And fighting countless AIM goons gets very tiresome very quickly. It's not only the Avengers story that just isn't great, but it's also its gameplay. And this comes from 2 areas that intersect. The first is the level design. In most of the missions you do, and anything outside of the main campaign, there are a variety of different missions that be completed by any character. And due to being completed by any character, they are incredibly basic, because none of them can be specified to Iron Man or Thor's ability to fly, or Black Widow's as a spy, or Hulk as a tank. These missions and levels just come off as bland, as they have to suit every single character. And here comes my biggest issue, and why this game just doesn't feel like the Avengers. Playing as Iron Man doesn't have the power and velocity that Iron Man should have. His thrusters are hindered by needing to match pace with Black Widow simply running, so that these characters can travel at the same speed. Thor and Hulk needing to hit normal human enemies multiple times just so they wouldn't be overpowered compared to their human companions. And lastly, the fact that every single Avenger has the same button layout. Because it's obvious Iron Man needs a ranged attack, so we need to make Hulk have one, so he randomly picks up rocks and throws them. The game just doesn't utilize the interesting and unique abilities each of these heroes have. Instead, they just feel like variations of the same basic character. There is a severe disconnect in this game though. Playing through the story campaign is somewhat decent, but as soon as you get to the endless MMO type grind they encourage, this game becomes mind-numbingly dull. The whole purpose of earning loot that only affects stat bonuses with ridiculous concepts such as upgrading Hulk's spine, this game feels like they wanted to create a continuous only MMO Destiny type game and then shove the Avengers concept in when it really just doesn't work. I have a lot of disdain for this game, particularly because I look at the Batman Arkham games, the recent Spider-Man games by Insomniac, and even the Guardians of the Galaxy game by Eidos that I'm playing through right now. I mourn what this game could have been, what it really should have been. Each of the core Avengers with their own dynamic moveset that truly made you feel like you were playing as these larger-than-life heroes, that told a compelling narrative, not just for each Avenger, but for the team as a whole. They could even have a co-op element that was based around more than just fighting cannon fodder. Each of these characters deserved their own game, given the same love and attention to detail that Rocksteady gave Batman and Insomniac gave Spider-Man. I still sincerely hope that one day we will see Iron Man, Hulk, Captain America, Thor, Black Widow, Hawkeye, Black Panther, Kate Bishop, Miss Marvel, as well as the whole Marvel roster receive their very own AAA game franchise that makes you feel like an Avenger.